Helena sat in the dimly lit corner of her vast, luxurious living room, staring blankly at the crystal glass of wine in her hand. The silence of the mansion echoed around her, amplifying the emptiness she felt inside. For years, she had lived this life of opulence, of grand parties, designer clothes, and a marriage that from the outside appeared perfect. But inside, she felt as hollow as the glass she held. The decision she had made wasn't an easy one, but it was the only way she could reclaim her life, her identity. Carlos, her husband of 15 years, was a man of power, influence, and wealth. He had given Helena everything she could ask for, materially at least. But over time, something within their relationship began to shift. What started as passion and partnership slowly dissolved into distance and indifference. Carlos was constantly absorbed in his business ventures, flying from one country to another, making deals, expanding his empire. Helena, on the other hand, had once been content with this life, with the gifts and the glamorous lifestyle, but now she felt forgotten, lost in the shadow of her husband's success. It was during one of his many business trips that Helena made her decision. She had been contemplating it for months, maybe even years, but now, sitting alone in their mansion, the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She could no longer live like this, trapped in a gilded cage. The money, the status, none of it mattered anymore. What she wanted was freedom, a chance to rediscover who she was before she became Mrs. Carlos Martinez. The next morning, while the city was still waking up, Helena began to pack. She moved quietly through the halls, careful not to wake the staff. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want any questions. With each item she placed in her suitcase, it felt like she was shedding another layer of her old life. Dresses, shoes, jewelry. Things that once symbolized her identity as Carlos's wife now felt like chains she was desperate to break free from. As she zipped up the suitcase, a sense of finality washed over her. This was it. She was leaving. But as much as Helena wanted to cut ties completely, a part of her hesitated. Would Carlos even notice she was gone? Would he care? For a brief moment, she considered leaving a note, explaining herself, maybe even asking for forgiveness. But what was there to explain? The truth was simple. She no longer loved him, and she no longer recognized the woman she had become. Helena realized that leaving a note wouldn't change anything. Carlos had already lost her, long before she ever packed her bags. By the time the sun began to peek through the curtains, Helena was ready. She glanced around the mansion one last time, taking in the grand marble floors, the towering crystal chandeliers, and the memories, both good and bad, that lingered within these walls. Then, without looking back, she walked out the door, leaving behind the life she once thought she wanted. She didn't know where she was going or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Driving away, Helena couldn't help but reflect on the early days of her marriage. Back then, Carlos had been everything she had ever dreamed of, handsome, charming, and wildly successful. They had met at a high-profile charity event, where he had swept her off her feet with his charisma and confidence. In those early years, life had been exciting. They traveled the world together, attended the most exclusive events, and dined in the finest restaurants. Helena had been proud to be by his side, to be seen as his equal in the eyes of the elite. But as time passed, the excitement faded. Carlos became consumed by his work, leaving Helena to navigate a life of loneliness masked by luxury. She tried to fill the void with shopping sprees, spa days, and lavish vacations, but none of it made her happy. It was like trying to fill a sinking ship with water. No matter how much she added, it was never enough. She had tried to talk to Carlos, to tell him how she felt, but every time, he dismissed her concerns, assuring her that things would get better once his next big deal was finalized. But that deal never seemed to come, and as the years rolled on, Helena found herself drifting further away from the man she had once loved. She no longer recognized the cold, distant person he had become. He was no longer the man who had promised her the world. Instead, he was a stranger who prioritized his empire over their relationship. leaving her to navigate the emptiness alone. The realization that their marriage was nothing more than a hollow shell hit her hard, but it also gave her the courage to make the choice she had made. Now, as she drove further and further away from the mansion, Helena felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, sadness for the life she had left behind, for the love that had once been so strong but had ultimately withered away. But there was also relief that she had finally taken control of her own destiny, that she was no longer defined by her role as someone's wife. She could finally breathe again. The road ahead was uncertain, but Helena welcomed the unknown. She was ready to rediscover herself, to build a life that was truly hers. For years, she had been living in the shadow of someone else's dreams. But now, it was time to chase her own. With the wind in her hair and the city disappearing in her rearview mirror, Helena knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of her new chapter, and for the first time in a long time, she was excited for what the future held. Helena's new life started with small steps. After leaving her lavish mansion and the high-profile lifestyle behind, she settled in a modest apartment on the quieter side of town. It was a far cry from the grand home she had shared with Carlos, but for her, it was the symbol of her newfound independence. She didn't need luxury anymore. What she craved was simplicity, peace, and the ability to breathe without feeling suffocated by the expectations of others. The minimalist decor of her new place, with its neutral tones and cozy furniture, gave her the sense of calm she had long been missing. Her days took on a different rhythm, no longer filled with extravagant events, designer shopping sprees, or endless hours of solitude in an empty mansion. Helena began to rediscover the beauty in the mundane. She found joy in the simple act of making her morning coffee, in walking through the nearby park, and even in taking time to read books she had long neglected. For years, her life had been governed by schedules and appearances. She had been the perfect wife, the one who smiled at every gala and made sure Carlos's image was untarnished. Now, she was learning to live for herself, and it felt liberating. Helena had also decided to return to work, something she hadn't done since she had married Carlos. Before their whirlwind romance, she had been a successful marketing executive at a prestigious firm. Though the gap in her resume was significant, her reputation and skills were undeniable. She reached out to a few old colleagues, and soon enough, she found herself sitting in an office again, leading projects and collaborating with a team. It was strange at first, being back in the workforce after so many years away. But as the weeks went on, Helena realized that this was exactly what she needed, a purpose outside of her past life. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting at work, Helena took a moment to reflect on how much her life had changed. She had gone from being Mrs. Carlos Martinez, the wife of a millionaire, to simply being Helena, a woman with her own dreams, her own ambitions, and her own identity. The transition hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, of loneliness, and even moments where she questioned whether leaving Carlos had been the right decision. But each time those doubts surfaced, she reminded herself of why she had left. She wanted more than to be someone's accessory. The decision to return to work had been a turning point for her. Not only had it given her financial independence, but it had also reconnected her with a part of herself she had forgotten. She remembered the thrill of creating a successful campaign, the satisfaction of seeing her ideas come to life, and the camaraderie that came with being part of a team. For years, she had been isolated, playing the role of the perfect wife, but now she was part of something again, something that didn't revolve around her husband's wealth or his ambitions. It was her own, and that made all the difference. Helena's days became fuller, but they also became more meaningful. She began to forge new friendships with her colleagues, something she hadn't expected. In the past, her social circle had been filled with other wealthy wives, all of them competing to see who could host the most lavish parties or wear the most expensive designer clothes. These new friendships, however, were different. They were based on mutual respect and shared experiences, not on status or wealth. For the first time in years, Helena felt like she could be herself around other people. No need to put on a facade. Despite the positive changes in her life, there were still moments where Helena felt the weight of her past. It wasn't easy to forget the years she had spent with Carlos or the life they had built together. Sometimes, she would see something, a photo in a magazine or a news article about one of his business deals, and it would all come flooding back. She would remember the early days of their marriage, the excitement they had shared, and the promises they had made to each other. It was hard to reconcile the man she had once loved with the man he had become, a distant, cold figure, more interested in profits than people. But even in those moments of nostalgia, Helena reminded herself that she had made the right choice. The person she had become after leaving Carlos was stronger, more independent, and more self-aware than the woman she had been during their marriage. She had learned to prioritize herself, something she had never done before. She wasn't just Carlos's wife anymore. She was Helena, a woman with her own path to follow. And while that path was still unfolding, she knew it was leading her in the right direction. Helena's new routine brought her peace, but it also brought clarity. She began to see her past life with Carlos for what it truly was, a gilded prison. She had been trapped in a world where appearances mattered more than emotions, where money and power took precedence over love and connection. Now, she was free of those constraints, and each day was a reminder of the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. It wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but Helena knew that she had made the right choice. For the first time in a long time, she was living for herself. As she continued to rebuild her life, Helena couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would she ever love again? Would she find someone who saw her for who she truly was, not just as a trophy wife or a status symbol? These questions lingered in the back of her mind, but for now, she was content with the progress she had made. She had learned to value herself, and that was the most important lesson of all. Whatever the future held, Helena knew one thing for certain. She was no longer defined by her past, and that was the greatest freedom of all. Several months passed since Helena had left her old life behind, and her days had settled into a peaceful routine. She no longer thought about Carlos or the life they had shared as often. She had become fully immersed in her work, surrounded by people who respected her for her skills rather than her social status. Life was, for the first time in a long time, quiet and uncomplicated. That is, until one afternoon when everything changed with a single glance. Helena had decided to treat herself to lunch at a quaint cafe near her office. It was a place she frequented often, one where the staff knew her by name and greeted her with warm smiles. She enjoyed the simplicity of it. The freshly brewed coffee, the smell of baked goods, and the peaceful hum of conversations around her. On this particular day, however, something shattered her tranquility. As she sipped her coffee and gazed out the window, she saw him, Carlos. He was seated at a table across the street, laughing and talking with a woman. Helena's heart skipped a beat. It had been over a year since she had last seen him, and the sight of him now, so close yet so distant, brought back a flood of emotions she wasn't prepared for. Her first instinct was to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him. But curiosity got the better of her, and her eyes drifted back to the scene unfolding in front of her. What struck Helena the most wasn't Carlos. It was the woman he was with. There was something about her that seemed eerily familiar. She was younger than Helena, with long dark hair and sharp, elegant features. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Helena's attention. It was the way she moved, the way she smiled. It was as if Helena was looking into a mirror from years ago, back when she had been Carlos's wife. The resemblance was uncanny, and it sent a shiver down Helena's spine. Unable to shake the feeling, Helena watched them for a few more moments, her mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? Why did she look so familiar? And more importantly, what was she doing with Carlos? A part of her wanted to march across the street and confront them, but another part of her, the more rational side, knew that she didn't owe Carlos anything. She had walked away from that life, and she wasn't going to let herself get pulled back into his orbit. But the nagging feeling of recognition wouldn't leave her. Helena left the cafe feeling unsettled, her thoughts consumed by the image of Carlos and the mysterious woman. She couldn't understand why it bothered her so much. It wasn't as if she was still in love with Carlos. Those feelings had died long ago, replaced by a sense of freedom and independence. But something about that woman gnawed at her. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't a simple coincidence. Over the next few days, Helena found it impossible to focus on anything else. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. Her work, which had once been a source of fulfillment, now felt like a distraction. She caught herself daydreaming during meetings, her thoughts drifting back to the cafe and the woman who had looked so much like her. It was as if her past had suddenly resurfaced, demanding her attention. Eventually, Helena couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. She reached out to an old friend, someone who still had connections in the social circles she had once been a part of. With a bit of reluctance, Helena explained the situation, hoping her friend could shed some light on who the woman was. The response came quicker than Helena had expected. The woman's name was Anna, and she had recently begun appearing at events with Carlos. She was a relative newcomer to the social scene, but what shocked Helena the most was that Anna was, in fact, her half-sister. The revelation hit Helena like a punch to the gut. She had never known about Anna. How could she? Their father had kept his past a secret, and Helena had grown up believing she was an only child. Now, suddenly, not only did she have a sister, but that sister was involved with her ex-husband. The betrayal she felt was overwhelming. How could Carlos, of all people, have gotten involved with someone so closely connected to her past? Helena's mind swirled with questions. Did Carlos know that Anna was her half-sister? Had he sought her out deliberately? Or was this all some bizarre twist of fate? And what did Anna know about Helena? Did she even realize that her new partner had once been married to her sister? The situation felt too surreal to be real, but Helena knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed to confront both Carlos and Anna to understand how this tangled web of relationships had come to be. The next day, Helena made up her mind. She would confront them, but not out of anger. She needed closure, and the only way to get it was by facing the truth head-on. She wasn't sure what she would say or how they would react, but one thing was certain. She could no longer live with the questions that had been plaguing her since that day in the cafe. She had worked too hard to build a new life for herself, and she wasn't about to let the ghosts of her past undo everything she had accomplished. As Helena prepared for the inevitable confrontation, a sense of calm washed over her. She realized that, no matter what happened, she had the strength to face it. She had walked away from Carlos once, and she could do it again if necessary. This time, however, she wouldn't be walking away with unanswered questions. She would get the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And with that thought in mind, Helena felt more ready than ever to face her past and take control of her future once again. Helena couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had taken root inside her. The revelation that Anna was her half-sister had changed everything. It wasn't just a shock of discovering a sibling she never knew existed. It was the fact that Anna was now entangled with Carlos, her ex-husband. The world seemed smaller, more suffocating, as if her past was pulling her back in when she had worked so hard to escape it. There was only one option left: to confront both Carlos and Anna and finally get the answers she needed. The confrontation didn't come easily. For days, Helena rehearsed the conversation in her head, imagining every possible scenario: what she would say, how they would react, and how she would maintain her composure. She didn't want this to turn into a scene, something dramatic or emotional. She simply wanted the truth, but deep down, she knew that no matter how calmly she tried to approach it, emotions would inevitably surface. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. Helena had heard through mutual acquaintances that Carlos and Anna would be attending a fundraising gala at a high-end hotel in the city. It was the kind of event Helena would have once attended regularly, back when she was married to Carlos and still immersed in that world of wealth and prestige. Now, the thought of stepping back into that environment made her stomach churn, but there was no avoiding it. This was her chance to speak with them both, face to face. Helena arrived at the gala feeling strangely out of place. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, Nothing too flashy, but enough to blend in with the crowd. As she walked through the grand ballroom, she was struck by how little had changed. The same faces, the same conversations, the same superficial smiles. It felt like stepping back into a life she had long left behind. But she wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here for closure. It didn't take long to spot them. Carlos and Anna stood near the bar, laughing and chatting with a small group of people. From a distance, they could have been any ordinary couple. But to Helena, the sight was jarring. The man who had once been her husband, now so comfortable with her half-sister, a woman who, only a short time ago, she hadn't even known existed. The resemblance between them was even more striking in person. It was as if Anna were a younger version of Helena herself, and the realization sent a shiver down her spine. Summoning her courage, Helena approached them. She waited for a break in their conversation before stepping forward. Her voice calm but firm. "Carlos, Anna," she said, her eyes moving between the two of them. "We need to talk." The reaction was immediate. Carlos looked startled, his eyes widening in surprise as he took in the sight of his ex-wife standing before him. Anna, on the other hand, seemed confused. She didn't recognize Helena, at least not at first. But the moment she realized who Helena was, her expression changed, shock, followed by a flicker of something Helena couldn't quite place. Guilt, or perhaps just the realization that their worlds had collided in the most unexpected way. "What is this about?" Carlos asked, his voice carefully neutral. He wasn't one to show emotion easily, but Helena could sense the tension in his posture. Helena didn't bother with small talk. There was no point in beating around the bush. "I know," she said, her gaze steady. "I know that Anna is my sister, my half-sister, to be exact." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Anna's face drained of color, and Carlos, for the first time in years, looked genuinely taken aback. Helena couldn't remember the last time she had seen him caught off guard like this. He was always so composed, always in control. But now, he seemed to be scrambling to process what she had just said. "Sister?" Anna finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Helena turned to her. "I didn't know either," she said softly. "Until recently. Our father, he had another family before he married my mother. You're his daughter, Anna. We share the same father." Anna looked as though she had been punched in the gut. Her eyes flickered with confusion, disbelief, and then, slowly, realization. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That can't be. I never," she broke off, her voice trembling as she tried to process the information. Carlos, meanwhile, was still standing there, silent and rigid. Helena could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to figure out how this revelation would affect everything. It was as if he were calculating the fallout, weighing the consequences. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You didn't tell me." Helena raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know. Do you think I would have kept something like this from you?" For a moment, no one said anything. The noise of the gala buzzed around them, but within their small circle, there was only silence. Helena could feel the tension mounting, the weight of so many unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Anna spoke again, her voice small but steady. "I didn't know I had a sister." Helena nodded slowly. "Neither did I, but now we know, and now we have to figure out what to do with that knowledge." Carlos cleared his throat, his voice regaining some of its usual confidence. "This doesn't change anything," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Anna and I, this has nothing to do with the past." But Helena wasn't so sure. The past had a way of creeping into the present, no matter how much he tried to bury it. And now, standing here with Carlos and Anna, she realized that their lives were more entangled than any of them had ever imagined. There was no escaping it. The truth had come to light, and they would all have to deal with the consequences. "I think it changes everything," Helena said quietly. "But that's something we'll have to figure out together." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Carlos and Anna standing there stunned. As she made her way through the crowd, Helena felt a strange sense of closure. She hadn't gotten all the answers she wanted, but at least now, the truth was out in the open. It was messy and complicated, but it was real. And for Helena, that was enough for now. Helena walked away from the confrontation, feeling a sense of closure, but it was far from the end of the story. The revelation that Anna was her half-sister had opened up a floodgate of questions that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the fact that she had a sibling she never knew about. It was the fact that this sibling was now intimately involved with her ex-husband, Carlos. As much as she wanted to leave the past behind, it was becoming clear that her history was more intertwined with her present than she had ever imagined. In the days following the gala, Helena found herself unable to focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment Anna realized they were sisters, the look of disbelief on her face, the stunned silence that followed. How could their father have kept something like this a secret for so long? And why had Anna never known about Helena? There were so many unanswered questions, and Helena knew that the only way to find peace was to confront the past head-on. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Helena reached out to an old family friend, someone who had known her father well. It wasn't easy digging up the past, especially when it involved a man who had been so carefully guarded in life. Her father had always been a private man, a successful businessman who prided himself on keeping his personal life separate from his public persona. But now, Helena realized there were pieces of his life that she had never been privy to. The family friend, an elderly woman named Margaret, agreed to meet Helena at a quiet cafe. Margaret had been close to Helena's parents for many years, and Helena hoped she might have some insight into this hidden part of her father's life. As they sat down over tea, Margaret's expression was a mix of sympathy and concern. She had known Helena since she was a child, and she could see the turmoil written all over her face. "I need to know the truth," Helena said, her voice steady but tense. "Did my father have another family before us?" Margaret sighed, taking a slow sip of her tea before answering. "Yes, dear, he did." Helena's heart sank. Hearing the confirmation out loud from someone who had known her father well made it all the more real. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret looked at her kindly, but there was a heaviness in her gaze. "Your father was a complicated man, Helena. He loved you and your mother very much, but there were things he didn't want to talk about. Painful things. He had a life before he met your mother, a life that didn't end the way he had hoped. When he married your mother, he saw it as a fresh start. I think he wanted to leave the past behind and protect you from it." Helena sat in silence, processing Margaret's words. It made sense in a way. Her father had always been protective of her, always careful to shield her from the darker aspects of his life. But this wasn't something he could hide forever. "What happened to the other family?" Helena asked, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Your father was married once before, to a woman named Isabel. They had a daughter together, Anna, but the marriage didn't last. Your father and Isabel separated when Anna was very young, and Isabel moved away. Your father tried to stay in touch with Anna, but over time, they grew apart. By the time he met your mother, it was as if that part of his life had faded into the background. He focused on building a new life, a new family." Helena's mind was spinning. Anna had been there all along, a part of her father's past that had been hidden from her. And now, through some twist of fate, Anna had reappeared in her life, connected to Carlos of all people. It was almost too much to comprehend. "Does Anna know about me?" Helena asked, her voice quiet. Margaret shook her head. "I don't believe so. Your father never talked about you or your mother with Isabel or Anna. It was his way of keeping the two parts of his life separate. I doubt Anna had any idea you existed until recently." Helena leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling with the weight of this new information. It wasn't just that her father had kept a secret. He had kept an entire family hidden from her. And now, she had to reconcile this new reality with the man she had always idolized. He wasn't the perfect, untouchable figure she had once believed him to be. He was flawed, just like anyone else, and his decisions had consequences that were now unraveling in front of her. As the days passed, Helena couldn't stop thinking about Anna. She wondered how her half-sister was coping with the news, how it must feel to discover that your father had a whole other family you knew nothing about. Helena wanted to reach out to her, to offer some sort of explanation or comfort, but she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. Their connection was so new, so fragile, and the circumstances surrounding it were far from ideal. Then, one afternoon, Helena received a message from Anna. It was brief, but to the point. "We need to talk." Helena agreed to meet Anna at a small cafe, the same place where she had met Margaret just days before. When Anna walked in, Helena could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. This was as strange and uncomfortable for her as it was for Helena, and the weight of their shared history hung heavy between them. "I didn't know," Anna said, her voice quiet as she sat down across from Helena. "I didn't know we were sisters. I didn't even know he had another family." Helena nodded, understanding the shock Anna must have felt. "I didn't know either," she admitted. "Our father kept so much from both of us." Anna looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly together in her lap. "I'm sorry about Carlos," she said after a moment, her voice barely audible. "I had no idea." Helena held up a hand to stop her. "You don't need to apologize. This isn't your fault. None of this is." They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken truths between them filling the space. Helena could see the pain in Anna's eyes, the confusion that mirrored her own. It was strange, seeing so much of herself in this woman she had only just met. This woman who had once been a stranger but was now something so much more. "I don't know where we go from here," Anna said finally, breaking the silence. Helena sighed softly. "Neither do I, but I think we can start by getting to know each other. We don't have to let our father's choices define us." Anna looked up, meeting Helena's gaze for the first time. There was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a tentative beginning to something neither of them could fully understand yet. "I'd like that," she said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, Helena felt like she was taking a step toward healing, toward a future that wasn't defined by the past. Helena left the cafe feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The conversation with Anna had been brief, but it was a start, an acknowledgement of the complex bond they shared and the possibility of a future where they could know each other, not as strangers, but as sisters. Yet, as Helena walked through the quiet streets of the city, she couldn't shake the lingering doubts that tugged at her mind. The revelation of Anna's existence and their father's hidden past had left scars that would take time to heal, if they ever truly could. For days, Helena found herself replaying the conversation over and over in her head. Anna had been so reserved, so careful with her words, and Helena couldn't blame her. Their relationship was still new, fragile, and weighed down by the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. How could two women who had lived completely separate lives for so long suddenly come together as family? And more importantly, how could they navigate the inevitable obstacles that lay ahead? One obstacle, of course, was Carlos. His relationship with Anna complicated everything. Helena had been trying to move on from her past with him for years, and now, just as she was finally finding her own path, Carlos was once again entangled in her life. This time, through her half-sister. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, and Helena wasn't sure how to handle it. She couldn't help but wonder what his true intentions were. Had he known about Anna's connection to her all along, or was this as much of a surprise to him as it had been to Helena? Helena tried to focus on her work, to lose herself in the projects that had once given her such satisfaction. But every time she sat at her desk, her mind drifted back to Carlos and Anna. She thought about their laughter at the gala, the way they had seemed so comfortable with each other, and a knot of unease formed in her stomach. She didn't want to care, but she did. It was impossible to separate her feelings for Carlos from the new reality she faced with Anna. The lines between past and present were blurring, and Helena wasn't sure where she stood anymore. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Helena decided to confront Carlos directly. She needed to know the truth about his relationship with Anna, about what he knew, and about how they would all move forward from here. She wasn't sure what she expected from the conversation, but she knew she couldn't keep living in this state of confusion and doubt. If she was going to rebuild her life, she needed clarity. Carlos agreed to meet her at a private restaurant where they could talk without interruptions. As she sat across from him, Helena couldn't help but notice how little he had changed. He was still the same confident, composed man she had once fallen in love with. But now, there was a distance between them, a wall built by years of separation and the secrets that had come to light. Helena took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. "I'm not here to talk about the past," Helena began, her voice calm but firm. "I need to understand what's happening now. What's your relationship with Anna, and how long have you known about our connection?" Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't know she was your sister until that night at the gala. I swear, Helena, this wasn't some plan to hurt you or bring up old wounds." Helena searched his face for any sign of deception, but Carlos seemed sincere. Still, the fact that they had both been blindsided by the same truth didn't make the situation any less complicated. "So what now?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "You're dating my sister, Carlos. You don't think that complicates things a little?" Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it does, but this thing between Anna and me, it's real. I didn't plan for any of this, but I can't ignore my feelings for her. And I don't want to. I don't want to hurt you, Helena, but I also can't walk away from this." Helena felt a surge of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. She had expected some version of this answer, but hearing it still stung. "I don't know how to feel about this," she admitted. "It's not just about you and Anna. It's about everything. Our past, my father, the lies he kept from me. It's all too much." Carlos reached across the table, his hand resting on hers for a brief moment before she pulled away. "I understand," he said softly, "but maybe this is a chance for all of us to move forward. We can't change what happened in the past, but we can decide how we handle things now." Helena looked away, her mind racing. Could she really do that? Could she accept the fact that her ex-husband and her half-sister were together and find a way to move past it? The rational part of her knew that Carlos and Anna had the right to be happy, even if their relationship was unexpected. But the emotional part of her, the part that still carried the scars of her past, struggled to let go of the pain. "I need time," Helena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to process all of this." Carlos nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. But just know that I'm not trying to replace anything we had. I respect what we shared, Helena. I always will." With that, the conversation ended, and Helena left the restaurant feeling as conflicted as ever. She had gotten some of the answers she needed, but the path forward still felt uncertain. Carlos's words echoed in her mind. This is a chance to move forward. But could she really do that? Could she let go of the past and accept the new reality she was faced with? As the days turned into weeks, Helena struggled to find her footing. She continued to meet with Anna, their relationship slowly evolving as they got to know each other. There were awkward moments, of course. Moments where the shadow of Carlos loomed large, reminding them both of the strange situation they were in. But despite the complications, there was something real forming between them. Anna was kind, thoughtful, and genuine, qualities that Helena admired, even if the circumstances were difficult. One evening, as Helena sat in her apartment reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized something important. The situation with Carlos and Anna, while painful and confusing, wasn't something she could control. What she could control was how she responded to it. She had the power to choose whether she would let this new chapter in her life be defined by anger and resentment, or whether she would open herself up to the possibility of healing and growth. It wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of frustration, of pain. But for the first time, Helena felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that, perhaps, she could find a way to move forward without letting the weight of her past drag her down. She wasn't the same person she had been when she was married to Carlos. She was stronger now, more resilient, and more determined to live her life on her own terms. As she looked out at the city skyline, Helena made a promise to herself. No matter what happened next, she would face it with grace and strength. She would build a future that wasn't defined by the secrets of the past, but by the choices she made moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. As the weeks passed, Helena found herself in a constant state of reflection, torn between the present and the past. The truth about her father, the revelation of Anna as her half-sister, and Carlos's complicated involvement with both of them. It was all so overwhelming. Despite her best efforts to keep moving forward, the weight of everything that had happened continued to press down on her. It wasn't just about Carlos and Anna anymore. It was about the choices that had led them all to this point, and the future that now lay uncertain before them. Helena had always believed that the past was something you could put behind you, something that would fade with time. But now she realized how naive that belief had been. The past wasn't just a distant memory. It was an ever-present force that shaped the choices she made, the relationships she built, and the person she was becoming. And no matter how much she tried to move on, it was clear that she couldn't fully escape it. The question was, how would she allow it to define her moving forward? One evening, as Helena sat by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, she began to reflect on the decisions that had led her here. She had left Carlos because she wanted a different life, one where she was free to be herself, to rediscover her identity without the constraints of being someone's wife. She had wanted to find her own path, and for a while, she had succeeded. But now, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, and she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. Her relationship with Anna was still evolving. They met regularly, slowly uncovering the layers of their shared history, but there was always an unspoken tension between them. Helena couldn't help but wonder if Anna resented her for having the life she never knew, being the daughter who grew up with their father, while Anna had been left in the dark. It was a complicated dynamic, one that neither of them had fully addressed. And then, of course, there was Carlos. Carlos had been trying to keep the peace, balancing his relationship with Anna while respecting Helena's feelings. But it was clear that things were far from simple. Helena knew that Carlos still cared for her. There were moments when their conversations hinted at the affection that had once defined their marriage. Yet, those feelings were overshadowed by the reality of their current situation. Carlos had moved on, and so had she. But with Anna now in the picture, everything felt entangled in ways that were hard to unravel. One afternoon, Helena decided it was time to have a more serious conversation with Anna. She invited her half-sister to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, hoping that the peaceful surroundings might ease the tension between them. As they walked along the tree-lined paths, Helena finally voiced the thoughts that had been weighing on her mind. "Anna, I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began, her voice steady but uncertain. "About our father, about Carlos, about us." Anna glanced over at her, her expression guarded. "I've been thinking about it too," she replied softly. "It's a lot to process." Helena nodded. "It is, and I know we're still figuring things out, but there's something I need to say." She paused, gathering her thoughts. I don't want this to be a source of pain for either of us. We didn't ask for this situation, but here we are. And I think the only way we can move forward is by being honest with each other." Anna stopped walking, turning to face Helena. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that Helena hadn't seen before. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Helena said, "that we need to talk about Carlos, about how this is affecting both of us." Anna's face flushed slightly, and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about you, and I didn't know about your past with him. But now that I do, I don't know how to handle it." Helena took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. I understand that. None of this was planned, and I'm not blaming you. But we can't ignore the fact that it's complicated. You're with a man I used to love, someone I shared a life with, and now you and I are sisters. It's strange." Anna nodded, her expression a mix of guilt and confusion. "I don't want to hurt you, Helena. I really don't. But I can't change how I feel about Carlos." Helena swallowed hard. She had expected this answer, but hearing it out loud still stung. "I know," she said quietly, "and I don't want to stand in the way of your happiness. But I also need you to understand that this isn't easy for me. I'm trying to accept everything, but it's going to take time." Anna looked at her, her eyes filled with empathy. "I get that, and I want to make this work between us. You're my sister, and I want to build something real with you." Helena smiled weakly, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. "We'll figure it out," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure how. They continued walking, the conversation drifting to other topics, lighter, less fraught with emotion, but the tension remained, lingering just below the surface. Helena knew that no matter how much they tried to move on, the situation with Carlos would always be a source of discomfort, a reminder of the complicated ties that bound them together. Later that evening, as Helena sat alone in her apartment, she found herself thinking about Carlos again. She hadn't seen him since their last conversation, and part of her was grateful for the distance. But another part of her missed him, missed the life they had once shared. It wasn't that she wanted to go back to that life. She had made peace with her decision to leave, but the memories still lingered, and she couldn't help but wonder what might have been if things had turned out differently. As much as she tried to focus on her future, the past kept pulling her back. And now, with Anna in the picture, it was even harder to separate her old life from the new one she was trying to build. It was as if her father's secrets had created a ripple effect, one that was still unfolding, pulling everyone closer together even as they tried to find their own paths. Helena realized that in the end, it all came down to choices. The choices her father had made to keep his past hidden, the choices Carlos had made to move on, the choices Anna had made to pursue a relationship with him. And now, the choices she had to make about how to move forward. There was no easy answer, no clear path. But Helena knew that she had the power to decide how much the past would influence her future. She wasn't sure where things would go from here. Her relationship with Anna was still fragile, and her feelings for Carlos were complicated in ways she hadn't fully processed. But one thing was certain. Helena was no longer the woman who had walked away from her old life. She was stronger now, more self-assured, and more willing to face the challenges that lay ahead. Whatever came next, she was ready to confront it head-on, with grace and determination. As she stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below, Helena made a promise to herself. She would find a way to navigate the complexities of her relationships with Carlos and Anna, and she would do it on her own terms. The past might have shaped her, but it didn't define her. And with that thought in mind, Helena felt a sense of calm settle over her. She didn't have all the answers, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Helena had always prided herself on being a woman of reason, someone who could navigate even the most complicated situations with grace. But now, as she found herself entangled in this web of emotions, history, and relationships, she realized how much more difficult it was to stay composed when her heart was involved. Anna had become more than just a half-sister. She had become a constant reminder of the choices their father made, and more painfully, the choices Carlos was making now. Over the next few weeks, Helena did her best to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She threw herself into her work, filling her days with meetings, projects, and deadlines. It was easier to focus on numbers and strategies than to deal with the swirling emotions that surfaced whenever she thought about Carlos and Anna. But no matter how hard she tried, Helena couldn't fully escape the weight of the situation. Even the smallest things, like passing by a cafe she and Carlos used to frequent, triggered memories she had thought she'd buried long ago. Her interactions with Anna had grown more frequent, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between them. They were still figuring out what it meant to be sisters, to navigate a relationship that had started under such strange circumstances. Helena wanted to be open to the possibility of a strong bond with Anna, but the reality was far more complicated. Every time she saw Anna, the thought of her relationship with Carlos lingered like an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to fully confront. One evening, after a long day at work, Helena found herself thinking about Carlos more than usual. She hadn't seen him in weeks, but his presence still loomed large in her thoughts. It wasn't just about their past anymore. It was about the future he was now building with Anna, a future that seemed to exist right in front of her, yet just out of reach. Helena hated the fact that it still affected her so deeply. She had left him. She had made her choice, and yet here she was, still tangled in the remnants of what they once had. Unable to shake the feeling, Helena decided to visit a place that had once been significant to both her and Carlos, the park where they used to take long walks together. It was a small, secluded spot near the edge of the city, a place where they could escape the pressures of their busy lives and just be with each other. As she walked through the familiar paths, Helena felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. The memories of their time together were bittersweet now, moments of happiness tinged with the knowledge of how things had ended. She found a bench and sat down, closing her eyes as she listened to the gentle rustle of the trees and the distant sound of birds. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to remember, really remember, the early days of her relationship with Carlos. Back then, everything had seemed so perfect. They were young, ambitious, and in love, and the world felt full of possibility. But over time, their lives had grown more complicated. Carlos had become consumed by his business, and Helena had started to feel more like an accessory to his success than a partner in his life. Now, as she sat in the park, Helena realized how much she had changed since those days. She was no longer the same woman who had been content to live in Carlos's shadow. She had built a life for herself, one that was defined by her own choices, her own desires. And yet, despite everything she had accomplished, the unresolved feelings about Carlos and Anna still lingered, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. Helena was lost in thought when she heard footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes and turned to see Carlos standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their shared history hanging in the silence. "Helena," Carlos said softly, breaking the tension, "I didn't expect to see you here." Helena gave a small, humorless laugh. "I didn't expect to see you either," she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I guess some places hold more memories than we realize." Carlos nodded, his eyes scanning the park as if he too were remembering the times they had spent here. "This place always reminded me of us," he admitted. "It's strange being back here now, after everything that's happened." Helena looked at him, her emotions a jumble of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. "Why are you here, Carlos?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Are you here to talk about Anna? About what's happening between you two?" Carlos's face softened, and he took a step closer, though he still kept his distance. "I didn't come here to talk about Anna," he said quietly. "I came here because I needed to think. About us. About everything." Helena frowned, unsure of what he meant. "There's nothing to think about, Carlos. We're over. We've been over for a long time." "I know," he said quickly, his voice almost pleading. "I know that. But that doesn't mean I don't think about what we had, about the choices we made. Don't you ever wonder if things could have been different?" Helena felt a lump form in her throat. She had asked herself that question 1,000 times, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to remember their past. But hearing Carlos say it out loud made it feel more real, more painful. "Of course I've wondered," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But wondering doesn't change anything. We made our choices, Carlos. You chose your career, and I chose to leave." Carlos looked down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I didn't realize how much I was losing until it was too late," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't appreciate what we had." Helena's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't let herself fall back into that place of longing and what-ifs. She had spent too long rebuilding her life, finding her own way. She couldn't allow herself to be pulled back into the past, no matter how much it still hurt. "It's too late for us, Carlos," she said gently. "We're different people now, and you're with Anna." Carlos winced at the mention of Anna, and Helena could see the conflict in his eyes. "I care about Anna," he said slowly, "but I never wanted to hurt you." Helena took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I know you didn't," she said, "but this situation is complicated. Anna and I are still trying to figure out what it means to be sisters, and you being with her, it makes everything harder." Carlos didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down on the bench next to Helena, leaving enough space between them to acknowledge the distance that had grown over the years. They sat in silence for a long time, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The sounds of the park faded into the background, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Finally, Carlos spoke, his voice soft but resolute. I don't know how to fix this, Helena. I don't know how to make things right." Helena looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "Maybe it's not about fixing things," she said quietly. "Maybe it's about accepting that some things can't be fixed. We can't go back, Carlos. We can only move forward." Carlos nodded, though his expression was one of resignation. "I just hope that moving forward doesn't mean losing everything." Helena didn't have an answer for him. She wasn't sure what the future held for her, for Carlos, or for Anna. All she knew was that they were all caught in the same tangled web, trying to find their way out. And no matter how much they tried to control the outcome, some things were beyond their control. As they sat there in the fading light, Helena realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant accepting it, learning from it, and finding the strength to build something new. Whatever happened next, she knew that she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her through everything else. And for the first time in a long time, that thought brought her a sense of peace. Helena spent the days after her encounter with Carlos, replaying their conversation over and over in her mind. Despite everything that had been said, she still felt like there were unresolved issues, things left unsaid. Carlos's regret had been palpable, but what had struck her the most was his uncertainty, his hesitation about the future, about Anna, and about what might still linger between them. It left Helena feeling uneasy, as though the ground beneath her feet wasn't as steady as she thought. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, Helena's phone buzzed with a message from Anna. The brief text was simple, but carried the weight of a much larger conversation. "We need to talk." It didn't surprise her. There had been an undercurrent of tension between them ever since the revelation of their shared father. But now, with Carlos's presence looming between them, it felt even more complicated. Helena knew that this conversation was inevitable, but she wasn't sure how to navigate it without hurting Anna or herself. They agreed to meet the next day at a small, quiet restaurant on the edge of the city. It was a place where they could talk without interruption, away from the noise and distractions of their daily lives. As Helena walked into the restaurant, she saw Anna already seated at a table by the window, her face a mix of nerves and determination. It was clear that she had something important to say, and Helena braced herself for what was to come. "Thanks for meeting me," Anna said, offering a small, tense smile as Helena sat down across from her. "Of course," Helena replied, her tone calm but cautious. "I've been thinking a lot about everything too." There was a moment of silence as they both tried to find the right words to start. It was Anna who finally broke the tension. "I've been trying to understand how we got here," she said softly, her eyes focused on the table between them. "This whole thing, it's such a mess, and I don't know how to make sense of it." Helena nodded, feeling the weight of Anna's words. "It is a mess," she agreed, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't think there's an easy way to untangle it, but I also don't think any of this is your fault, Anna. You didn't choose this, and neither did I." Anna looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. "But I feel like I've made things worse. By being with Carlos, I didn't know about you, about your history with him. And now, I feel like I'm caught in the middle of something I don't understand." Helena sighed, feeling the tension in her own chest as she listened to Anna's words. "You're not in the middle of anything, Anna. You didn't create the situation. Our Father did. He's the one who kept us apart, who made choices that we're only now beginning to understand. And as for Carlos," Helena paused, searching for the right words. "I don't blame you for being with him. I don't." Anna's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You don't?" Helena shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "No, I don't. I can't control who Carlos chooses to be with, and neither can you. But that doesn't make it easy. It's still hard for me, seeing the two of you together. Not because I want him back, but because it's a reminder of everything I walked away from and everything I lost in the process." Anna sat in silence for a moment, her brow furrowed as she processed Helena's words. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said quietly. "I didn't know how deep things ran between you and Carlos. And now, I'm starting to realize just how much there is between all of us." Helena nodded, her heart heavy with the truth of the situation. "There's a lot of history here, Anna, and I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with it all." The conversation shifted as they began to talk more about their father, about the man who had kept their connection a secret for so long. Anna shared stories about the brief moments she remembered with him, moments that seemed so different from the life Helena had known with him. It was like they were talking about two different men, and in a way, their father had lived two lives, and they were both trying to reconcile the man they had known with the man they were now discovering. "I always wondered why he never came around more," Anna admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "I thought it was because he didn't care, or that he was too busy with his work. But now I know it's because he was living a whole other life with you." Helena felt a pang of guilt at Anna's words. "He wasn't perfect," she said softly. "I thought he was when I was younger, but now I see how flawed he was. He made choices that hurt both of us, and now we're the ones left to deal with the consequences." Anna nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? To realize that the person we thought we knew was hiding so much from us. It makes you question everything." Helena couldn't agree more. Discovering her father's secret had shaken the foundation of her understanding of her own life, and now, with Carlos and Anna both intertwined in this web of relationships, it felt like everything she thought she knew was being upended. But there was something else, something deeper that Helena hadn't yet confronted. As they continued talking, Helena realized that the real issue wasn't just about her father or even Carlos. It was about her. It was about the way she had spent so many years running. From her past, from her feelings, from the difficult conversations she had avoided. And now, sitting across from Anna, she knew that she couldn't run anymore. "There's something I need to tell you," Helena said suddenly, her voice more serious now. Anna looked at her, surprised by the shift in tone. "What is it?" Anna asked, her eyes searching Helena's face for an answer. Helena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words she was about to say. "I've been trying to be strong through all of this, trying to move forward without letting it affect me too much. But the truth is, I'm still struggling. Seeing you with Carlos, it brings up so many feelings I thought I'd left behind, and I don't know how to deal with that." Anna's face softened, and she reached across the table to take Helena's hand. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's hard for me too. I never wanted to be the cause of any pain for you." Helena squeezed her hand, grateful for the empathy she saw in Anna's eyes. "I know you didn't, and I'm not asking you to change anything. I needed you to know that I'm still working through all of this." Anna nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "We'll figure it out together," she said. "We're family now, Helena, and that means we'll get through this, no matter how complicated it is." Helena felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't facing this alone. She had Anna by her side, and despite the tangled mess they had inherited, they were committed to finding a way forward. As they finished their meal and said their goodbyes, Helena walked away feeling lighter than she had in weeks. There were still so many questions, so many unresolved issues, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't have all the answers, but she had the strength to keep moving forward. And that, for now, was enough. Helena stood by the window of her apartment, staring out at the city skyline as the sun set behind the tall buildings. The past few months had been some of the most challenging of her life, forcing her to confront truths she never thought she'd face and reconcile emotions she had long buried. The revelation of Anna as her half-sister, the complicated entanglement with Carlos, and the hidden secrets of her father's past. It had all weighed heavily on her, like an emotional burden she couldn't quite shake. But now, as she reflected on everything that had transpired, she felt a strange sense of peace. The conversation with Anna had been a turning point. For the first time, they had spoken openly about their feelings, about the pain and confusion that came with discovering their shared history. It wasn't easy. Nothing about their relationship had been easy, but it was a start. And in that moment, Helena realized something important. She didn't have to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that she and Anna were committed to building a relationship, to facing their shared past together rather than apart. Carlos was still a lingering presence in both of their lives, but Helena had come to terms with the reality of his relationship with Anna. It still stung, of course. There were moments when she felt a pang of jealousy or sadness when she thought about their connection. But more than anything, Helena had come to accept that Carlos was no longer hers. They had been important to each other once, but that chapter of their lives was closed. It was time for her to let go of the what-ifs and embrace the life she was creating for herself. As she watched the sun dip below the horizon, Helena's phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was a message from Anna, a simple invitation to dinner the following week. Helena smiled as she read the text, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. For so long, she had thought of family as something she had lost. First with her father's death, and then with her separation from Carlos. But now, she realized that family could take on different forms. Anna was family, even if their relationship was still new and evolving. They were sisters, bound by blood and by the shared experience of discovering their father's secrets. Helena's thoughts drifted to Carlos. She hadn't seen him since their conversation in the park, and part of her was relieved. It had been a difficult discussion, filled with emotions neither of them had fully processed. But it was necessary. For too long, Helena had been holding on to unresolved feelings of regret, anger, and even guilt about how things had ended between them. But now, she understood that they had both made choices, and those choices had led them down different paths. Carlos had moved on with Anna, and while that was complicated in itself, it wasn't her burden to carry anymore. Helena knew that Carlos and Anna would have their own challenges to face. Their relationship was complicated, not just because of Helena's history with Carlos, but also because of the weight of the secrets their father had kept from both of them. But that was their journey, not hers. For the first time, Helena felt free to focus on her own path, on the life she was building for herself without the shadow of the past looming over her. As she moved through her apartment, tidying up and preparing for the evening, Helena's thoughts turned to the future. What would it look like? For so long, her life had been defined by her relationship with Carlos, by the role she had played as his wife. But now, she was no longer defined by anyone else's expectations. She was free to create a life that was entirely her own. It was a daunting thought, but it was also liberating. Helena had spent so many years living in the shadow of someone else's dreams. But now, she had the opportunity to pursue her own. The next few days passed in a blur of work and personal reflection. Helena continued to meet with Anna, each conversation bringing them closer as they navigated the complexities of their newfound relationship. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when the past seemed to hang between them like an invisible wall. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Helena was learning to trust Anna, to see her not just as a reminder of her father's secrets, but as a person in her own right, a sister who was also trying to make sense of her place in the world. It was during one of their dinners together that Anna broached the subject of Carlos again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Anna began, her voice hesitant but steady, "about how this whole situation has affected all of us." Helena nodded, setting down her fork and giving Anna her full attention. "I've been thinking about it too." Anna sighed, her expression conflicted. "It's hard, isn't it? Trying to move forward while still feeling like we're tied to the past. Carlos and I, we're still figuring things out, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're important to me. Our relationship is important to me." Helena felt a surge of emotion at Anna's words. She had never expected to find such a deep connection with the woman who, just months ago, had been a complete stranger. "You're important to me too," Helena replied softly. "And I think we'll both figure things out, even if it takes time." Anna smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I hope so. I want us to have a real relationship. Not just because we're sisters, but because I care about you." Helena returned her smile, feeling a sense of gratitude for the bond they were building. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. And that was enough for now. As they finished their dinner and parted ways for the evening, Helena walked home feeling lighter than she had in months. The burden of the past was still there, but it was no longer weighing her down. She had made peace with the choices that had brought her to this point, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. That night, as Helena lay in bed, she thought about the journey she had been on, about the woman she had been when she first left Carlos, and the woman she had become since then. She had faced heartbreak, betrayal, and the painful truth about her family, but through it all, she had grown stronger. She had learned that she was capable of building a life on her own terms, and that she didn't need to be defined by anyone else's expectations. For the first time in a long time, Helena felt a sense of clarity. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but she knew that she was ready for it. She had Anna by her side, and while the past would always be a part of her, it no longer controlled her. She was free to move forward, to build a life that was truly her own. As she closed her eyes, Helena felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced the ghosts of her past, and now she was ready to embrace the possibilities of her future, whatever they might be. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.